The South Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the stars, a vast and silent abyss cloaked in moonlight and cold. Somewhere far below, isolated in the southern reaches of the world, the Falkland Islands lay windswept and battered, a remote archipelago, little more than specks of rock and grass lashed by Antarctic winds. They had long been the subject of dormant sovereignty disputes, but few could have predicted they would become the epicenter of a modern war. In April 1982, that unlikely fuse was lit, and now the flames of conflict flickered over desolate peat bogs and jagged coastal cliffs. But nearly 4,000 miles to the north, on Ascension Island, a volcanic dot in the mid-Atlantic halfway between Africa and South America, another kind of battle was taking shape. At RAF Wide Awake Airfield, nestled amid barren lava fields and ringed by radar dishes and fuel drums, an enormous delta-wing bomber sat silently under the night sky. It looked like a relic of a different era, a Cold War monster built for nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But tonight, it had a new purpose. The aircraft was the Avro Vulcan B-2, and it was about to be thrust into history once again, not as a nuclear deterrent, but as a conventional strike platform in one of the most audacious missions of modern air warfare. The operation was codenamed Black Buck 1. The objective was deceptively simple: bomb the runway at Port Stanley Airport in the Falklands, but the execution would be anything but. This was not a standard sortie over Europe or a tactical engagement in a neighboring theater. This was a mission that would stretch the limits of logistics, engineering, human endurance, and luck. It would cover a round trip of nearly 8,000 miles, making it at the time the longest bombing raid ever attempted. No mission of such range had been executed by a non-nuclear aircraft. No Vulcan had flown combat in decades. And yet, there was no alternative. Argentina had invaded and occupied the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982, asserting its long-standing claim over what it called the Islas Malvinas. British sovereignty, held since 1833, was suddenly and violently challenged. British pride was wounded. Parliament was outraged. The diplomatic efforts to avoid war floundered under the weight of national sentiment and geopolitical momentum. The only way to restore British control now was by force, and so, a task force of warships, carriers, submarines, and troops had set sail from the UK, headed for the bottom of the world. But the British task force had a problem. It was vulnerable. As the warships closed in on the exclusion zone around the Falklands, the Royal Navy faced a formidable threat from the air. Argentina's Mirage 3 fighters, A4 Skyhawks, Canberra bombers, and French-built Super Étendards armed with deadly Exocet missiles could strike at British ships with terrifying speed. And they could do so thanks to the airfield at Port Stanley, which gave Argentina a forward base within easy reach of the islands and surrounding seas. If the British were to land troops and support them with naval and air power, they had to neutralize that runway. But the Royal Navy carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, could not get close enough without risking catastrophic losses. The Argentine air threat was real, and it had to be diminished before amphibious operations could even be considered. There were no British fighters or bombers based in the region. There were no bases nearby. The Americans, while politically supportive, offered no direct military intervention. The British were on their own. That's when the Royal Air Force turned to the only option available, however improbable it seemed: the Vulcan. The Avro Vulcan B-2 was a massive, high-altitude strategic bomber developed in the 1950s to deliver nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. It was fast, powerful, and had an iconic delta-wing shape that made it look like a futuristic spacecraft. But by 1982, the Vulcan was obsolete. Most had been retired. The remaining aircraft were used primarily for training and electronic countermeasures. They had not dropped a conventional bomb in over 2 decades. They were not fitted for in-flight refueling. And their navigation systems were designed for Arctic routes, not precision bombing in the Southern Hemisphere. Still, the aircraft had one crucial advantage. range. With enough fuel and enough refueling tankers, it could reach the Falklands from Ascension Island and return. Barely. Thus began one of the most complex and daring air raids in modern history. The mission would not involve just one aircraft. It would require a symphony of airframes. To get a single Vulcan to the target and back, no fewer than 11 Victor tankers would be needed. These were modified V-bombers themselves, now serving as aerial refueling platforms, but they too had limited range. So, in an astonishing display of aerial logistics, even the tankers would need to refuel one another, peeling off at predetermined points like celestial bodies exchanging lifeblood mid-flight. Each hour would see tankers pass fuel to tankers, only for one of them to pass fuel to the Vulcan, and so on. Any deviation, any delay, and the entire mission could collapse. And there were problems. Many. The Vulcans had to be refitted with functioning bomb racks. They had to be modified for air-to-air refueling with drogue baskets. Pilots and navigators had to relearn long-distance navigation using astrodomes, sextants, and dead reckoning. In-flight refueling probes snapped under pressure. Boom assemblies cracked. Radios failed during tests. And still, the plan moved forward. There was no time to wait. Every hour brought the task force closer to the danger zone. Every delay increased the risk. The mission was scheduled for the early morning hours of May 1st, 1982. The plan called for the lone Vulcan, call sign Victor 607, to strike the runway at Port Stanley with 21 1,000-pound bombs. The goal wasn't to destroy the entire airfield. That would be impossible. But a single crater in the middle of the runway could prevent fast jets from taking off or landing. It would limit Argentina to using the airfield only for small transports and helicopters, crippling their ability to project air power over the islands. It was a gamble, a massive, improbable gamble built on aging aircraft, untested logistics, and razor-thin margins. But it was the only card Britain had left to play. As the sun dipped beneath the equator on April 30th, the final preparations began. RAF ground crews fueled up the Vulcan, loaded its bombs, and conducted final inspections by flashlight. Pilots briefed over folding maps. Navigators checked coordinates again and again. The Victor tankers lined up, engines whining, as the crews prepared for an air ballet that would span the Atlantic. And as midnight neared, under the star-choked sky of Ascension Island, Black Buck 1 roared down the runway and lifted into history, its long nose rising like a sword, pointed at the far end of the world. And so a plan was born, a plan as ambitious as it was improbable. The mission was to bomb the Port Stanley airfield on the remote Falkland Islands, using aging British bombers with Cold War DNA. These were aircraft from another era, designed to fly high above Europe and deliver nuclear vengeance to the Soviet Union, not to drop conventional iron bombs on a windswept strip of runway at the edge of the world, but the Vulcan would now be called upon to do just that. The target was 3,900 nautical miles away. That meant a round trip of nearly 8,000 miles, the longest bombing raid ever attempted at the time. No bomber had ever flown that far to strike a target with conventional ordnance and then returned. There would be no satellite-guided munitions, no GPS navigation, no laser targeting or digital feedback. This was a mission straight from the pages of a bygone era. Old-school airmanship, celestial navigation, analog instruments, and a whole lot of British audacity. Everything depended on calculation, coordination, and courage. The aircraft chosen for the mission was Vulcan XM607, a beast of steel and aluminum with a 120-foot wingspan and a sleek, futuristic delta shape that looked more like a spaceship than a bomber. The Vulcan had been conceived during the early Cold War, built to penetrate Soviet airspace at high altitudes, deliver thermonuclear weapons, and outrun fighters. But by 1982, the Vulcan was considered a relic. The RAF had begun retiring the type years earlier. XM-607 herself had come perilously close to the scrapyard, grounded in semi-retirement, her avionics outdated, and airframe showing the wear of decades of training flights. She was never supposed to fly in combat again. But war changes everything. The aircraft was dragged out of near obsolescence and rapidly refitted for a conventional bombing role it had never been designed to perform. The bomb bay was modified to carry 21,000-pound British GP bombs. Targeting systems were hastily updated. The old H-2S radar, an antiquated device from World War II, was brought back into service to help locate the airfield in poor visibility. To counter Argentine radar and missiles, a suite of electronic countermeasures was bolted in: radar jammers, chaff dispensers, and decoys. But the biggest challenge wasn't what the Vulcan could carry or even what it could hit. It was how far it had to fly to do so. The Vulcan simply didn't have the range. Even with full tanks, the aircraft could not come close to reaching Port Stanley and returning. It wasn't just far, it was impossibly far. For an aircraft of that size, carrying that much weight, with no friendly airfields between Ascension Island and the Falklands, refueling mid-air was the only option. But even that wasn't simple. The Vulcans had not been fitted for aerial refueling in years. Some had never done it at all. So engineers scrambled to modify the fuel, probes, patch the pressure lines, and test the systems. Accidents occurred. At least one refueling probe snapped off in early tests. It was a race against time, and everything was being done on the fly, literally and figuratively. To refuel the Vulcan en route would require the Handley Page Victor tankers, big, elegant aircraft once intended to drop bombs themselves, now converted into flying fuel farms. But the sheer distance meant that the Victors would not only need to refuel the Vulcan, they would also need to refuel each other, and so the planners devised a complex aerial choreography involving no fewer than 11 Victor tankers in order to get one bomber to the Falklands and back. The operation would take over 16 hours and involve multiple layers of refueling across a staggered network of rendezvous points. It would become the most elaborate and ambitious air-to-air refueling operation ever attempted by the Royal Air Force. The tankers would leapfrog each other in waves, refuel the Vulcan, then peel away to top off another tanker, which would then do the same. Each exchange of fuel had to be exact. Every pound of fuel had to be measured, allocated, and used with precision. The smallest mistake could cascade through the chain and doom the entire mission. There were no backup bombers. If something failed en route, the strike would be off. There were also few emergency options. A malfunctioning fuel line, a missed rendezvous, or sudden weather could leave the Vulcan with no choice but to ditch in the frigid South Atlantic, or worse, land in enemy territory. But there was no turning back. As the sun dipped below the equator on April 30th, 1982, RAF Wide Awake on Ascension Island was a hive of activity. Technicians in coveralls moved like shadows under the winged giants, refueling, checking systems, mounting bombs. The air shimmered with heat from the jet exhausts and the tension of the unknown. In the cockpit of XM-607, Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, just 39 years old, ran through checklists. He had never flown a combat mission before, but tonight he would lead one of the most daring of the entire conflict. Withers' crew was a tight five-man team, hand-picked for skill and endurance. His co-pilot, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Graham, would share the burden of flying and emergency handling. Navigator radar John Reeve would help guide them through storms, across endless ocean, and into the Falklands using map, compass, and stars. Navigator plot. David Garlick would double-check course and timing down to the second. The Air Electronics Officer, Bob Wright, would operate the jammers and deploy the countermeasures, constantly scanning for threats. Together, they were not just crewmates. They were a single unit bound by purpose. Every man knew the risks. They were flying into a hornet's nest, across hostile seas, toward a target protected by radar, anti-aircraft guns, and the possibility of interception by Argentine mirages. They would be alone out there, no escort, no support. Just a trail of tankers behind them, and a strip of tarmac thousands of miles ahead. No one had ever tried anything quite like this, and if it failed, it would fail spectacularly. Just before midnight, the first wave of Victor tankers took off, roaring down the Ascension runway, bound for their fueling stations over the ocean. Then came XM-607, fully loaded, heavy and ponderous at takeoff, her massive engines thundering against the humid night. The nose lifted, the delta wings caught the wind, and slowly, impossibly, the bomber rose into the air, an obsolete machine reborn, carrying the hopes of a nation on its long, lonely journey into the unknown. Above the clouds, the stars shimmered. Below, the ocean stretched black and silent. Somewhere over the horizon, the Falklands waited. XM-607 was on her way to make history. The mission began like clockwork. At precisely 10 to 11 p.m., the first aircraft lifted off from Ascension Island, engines howling into the humid darkness. One after another, the Victor tankers followed, each spaced to the second, their flight paths aligned like beads on a string. Then, with all systems green, Vulcan XM-607 thundered down the runway, its bomb bay packed with 21,000-pound bombs and its wings heavy with the burden of history. The black shape vanished into the southern sky, shadowed by a fleet of tankers that would be its lifeline. For hours, the formation droned steadily southward, suspended between starlight and steel. Radio chatter crackled with code words and time checks as the first of the refueling operations began. At 22,000 feet in absolute darkness, the Victor tankers extended their refueling probes like mechanical umbilical cords. Beneath the red glow of cockpit lamps and guidance beacons, pilots made minute adjustments. The Vulcan's refueling probe met the drogue basket, a moment of contact between two giants, and the fuel began to flow. Measured, vital, irreplaceable. It was aerial ballet, under fire drill conditions. Each transfer required absolute focus. The Vulcan and the tankers had to maintain precise speeds, altitudes, and headings, all while flying blind over a black ocean. Every droplet of fuel mattered. Every rendezvous was a gamble. And soon, that gamble began to falter. The first sign of trouble came early. One of the critical Victor tankers, tasked with refueling another tanker that would in turn feed XM-607, developed a fuel pump malfunction. It was a small mechanical failure, but its consequences echoed down the line. The crew was forced to abort and turn back to Ascension. That single loss disrupted the entire chain of support aircraft, triggering a cascade of recalculations. Fuel load charts were reevaluated, timetables redrawn. The airborne commanders made swift, nerve-wracking decisions. Tankers that had been scheduled to return now had to press further. Others had to stretch their range. In minutes, the plan became a living thing, flexing and adapting on the edge of feasibility. But the mission went on. Then, a second blow. XM-598, the backup Vulcan, suffered a pressurization system failure. At high altitudes, the crew risked hypoxia. There was no choice but to abort. The redundant hammer was gone. All hopes rested now on one aircraft, XM-607. She was alone, 3,000 miles from base, flying a mission no one had ever attempted before, and now she was the only shot left. The flight grew colder and lonelier as it pushed south. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by instrument checks, recalculated headings, and the occasional contact with tanker crews. Inside XM-607, the five-man crew operated like a machine, disciplined, calm, alert. Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, his hands steady on the control column, kept the bomber on course. In the back, Navigator Radar John Reeve and Navigator Plot David Garlick cross-checked positions using celestial sightings and inertial navigation. With no GPS, they relied on dead reckoning and star fixes. A single miscalculation could send them hundreds of miles off course, with no way back. As they neared the Falklands, Withers dropped the Vulcan from its cruising altitude to just 300 feet above the sea. The thick black ocean loomed just below the wingtips. The aircraft, designed for high-level nuclear attack, now hugged the waves like a torpedo. The drop was brutal. Turbulence slammed into the airframe. The Vulcan moaned under the sudden stress, but radar coverage was now a threat, and low flying was the only hope of avoiding detection. XM-607 became a ghost. For nearly 100 miles, she skimmed the sea, invisible to Argentine radar. Below, the coastline of East Falkland crept into view, wind-beaten, rocky, and ominously quiet. Argentine radar stations scanned the sky for high-altitude threats. They found none. XM-607 had slipped beneath them, unseen and unheard. At precisely 4 a.m. local time on May 1st, 1982, as planned, the Vulcan climbed. From 300 feet, Withers pulled the stick gently and brought the aircraft up to 10,000 feet in a long arc. The black silhouette of Port Stanley now lay below, barely visible in the dim twilight of early dawn. As the aircraft leveled out, the bomb doors opened, a groaning mechanical yawn of steel. Inside the bomb bay, 21 bombs waited in silence. Withers held the Vulcan steady. The aircraft flew level, true. Beneath them, the crosshairs aligned over the center of the Port Stanley airfield. Then, in a single controlled burst, the bombs fell, released one after another, cascading from the belly of the aircraft like metallic rain. 21 bombs screamed downward, trailing vapor and silence. Moments later, the first of them struck. One bomb landed dead center on the runway, carving a massive crater that rendered it instantly unusable for high-performance jets. Others peppered the airfield's flanks, destroying fuel depots, radar installations, maintenance sheds, and equipment. The shockwave ripped through sleeping quarters. Argentine anti-aircraft batteries opened fire a heartbeat too late. Tracers stabbed the sky, but the Vulcan was already climbing, banking westward into escape. The raid had lasted seconds, but its impact would ripple for days. The Vulcan turned toward the Atlantic, her bomb bay now empty, her mission complete. But she was still thousands of miles from home, and she was not safe yet. The return would be another marathon. Fuel was tight. The weather had begun to shift. The long, lonely voyage back to Ascension had only just begun. Yet in those critical seconds over Port Stanley, history had been made. XM-607 had struck the first blow of the British counteroffensive. A runway had been cratered, a message sent. Argentina's grip on the islands had been challenged not from the sea but from the sky, from half a world away. The Vulcan, an aging relic of another war, had proven it could still roar, and the crew, 5 men in the cockpit of an old warbird, had flown farther and hit harder than anyone thought possible. Black Buck 1 was not over, but its most dangerous moment had passed. Now it was a race against fuel, time, and fate to get home. The Argentine garrison was caught completely off guard. Sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but it was too late. The Vulcan was already gone, diving back to low altitude and heading out to sea. But their ordeal was far from over. Now came the most dangerous part, getting home. XM-607 was low on fuel, and any misstep could leave them stranded over the freezing South Atlantic. But the tankers were waiting. Like clockwork, the remaining victors swooped in, and refueling began again, this time with fewer assets and less margin for error. Hours passed. The sun rose behind them. The aircraft grew colder. Withers fought exhaustion as he guided the bomber northward, kept alive by sheer discipline and coordination. At long last, after 8,000 miles and nearly 16 hours in the air, XM-607 touched down on Ascension Island. The crew emerged, blinking against the daylight, greeted not with fanfare but by fellow airmen and engineers who had risked just as much in the skies behind them. The mission was complete. Black Buck 1 had succeeded. The immediate strategic impact was debated. The damage to the airfield slowed Argentine operations but did not eliminate their presence. Yet the psychological impact was profound. Argentina now knew they were vulnerable, even on their doorstep. Morale within British forces soared. NATO allies watched in awe. The Soviets took notice. Most importantly, Black Buck 1 proved that Britain had the will and the means to strike, no matter the distance. In the weeks that followed, additional Black Buck missions were launched, targeting radar installations and anti-aircraft systems. Not all went smoothly. One Vulcan was forced to land in Brazil after damage, leading to diplomatic tension. But the missions achieved their purpose. They kept the Argentines off balance and demonstrated the reach of British resolve. Years later, Black Buck 1 would be studied in war colleges and documentaries. Pilots who flew it would receive medals. XM607 would be preserved in a museum. But the mission would forever stand as a symbol, not just of technical brilliance or Cold War innovation, but of courage. It was an act of calculated defiance, the kind of strike that rewrote what was possible in aerial warfare. Even as technology advanced, the echoes of that night in 1982 still resonate. Over a windswept runway thousands of miles from home, the roar of a lone Vulcan reminded the world, distance is no barrier to determination, and when freedom calls, the skies will carry the answer.